All right, our final speaker for the evening is Kristina Froling, who's an international advocate in the fields of bystander intervention, active shooter response, and violence prevention within schools, workplaces, and public spaces. Ms. Froling is founder of the Koshka Foundation for Safe Schools, a nonprofit that provides training on the prevention of school and workplace violence, education on active shooter preparedness, and consultation on post-crisis recovery. Ms. Froling travels extensively within the United States and Canada to spread the importance of preparedness and joint training between citizens, educators, law enforcement, emergency managers, and first responders. Ms. Froling started the nonprofit after becoming one of the most critically injured survivors of the 2007 Virginia Tech school tragedy, where she was shot 3 times. Ms. Froling is also co-founder of LiveSafe, a mobile technology communication platform for sharing safety-related information that's used by over 100 college campuses as well as corporations and hospitals. She's delivered trainings to numerous law enforcement and government agencies, as well as schools and workplaces, including school resource officers, university administrators, fire and emergency managers, FEMA, the FBI, and private corporations. She's a member of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals and graduated from Virginia Tech with a BS in International Studies. And I'll add that I've had the good fortune of working with and knowing Ms. Froling for quite a number of years. She actually last spoke at UWT 10 years ago, I realized. It was 10 years ago was the last time. And she's a brilliant and passionate violence prevention advocate who not only speaks from her profound personal experience as a survivor, but also as someone incredibly knowledgeable about research and what policies and practices actually work. So please welcome Kristina Froling.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Mathis, for that very kind introduction. I did want to kind of joke, I'm following 3 PhDs. If one of you could just loan me theirs for the evening. I know it's not that easy. I know. But thank you very much for being here, for being part of this very important conversation. As Dr. Mathis noted, we're talking a lot today about mass violence and the impacts, and we're going to ground it a little bit. I'm going to share with you my story, my experience when I was a student at Virginia Tech, just as a quick overview. In 2007, a student who was the perpetrator on our campus walks into a dormitory and then an engineering hall, and in the span of about 11 and a half minutes is going to wound and injure and kill 30 members of our community. You're not going to see anything overly graphic this evening, but we are going to talk about a school shooting. So I ask you just to, breathe, to kind of do what you have to do to take care of yourselves as well. I'm going to share with you not only my personal experience, but also more importantly, what we learned about prevention and about recovery and survivors in a much broader scale. So to kind of take us back a little bit, I'm going to start with this photograph. It's okay, you guys can laugh. It's fine. I'm 19 years old, this photograph. No fashion sense, no color coordination. Safety and security is the last thing on my mind. The environment where our attack took place is the campus of Virginia Tech. It's on the East Coast. It's one of the largest public research universities in Virginia. We have at the time about 28,000 students. It's 141 buildings. It's a massive, massive space. But as you can see for the photographs, it's very much the quintessential college experience. We're known for football. We're known for aerospace, engineering. It is the last place you'd ever imagine something like this about to occur. Like many universities in the United States, we have a sworn accredited campus police department. They are doing a lot of training with our local town of Blacksburg Police Department. We're going to have just very technically trained folks that are able to be there to respond. But the morning of our attack for me began like any other day in that I was late. I was living off campus at the time. It was a dreary, cold Monday morning. It's quite interesting. Survivors often after these incidents, we remember the small details, right? What we had for breakfast that day, what clothes we chose to wear. For me, the only decision I had time to really think about that day was what kind of shoes I was going to wear. And because it was snowing, I went against my usual flip-flops, and I chose the closed-toed shoe, the sneaker, which I know sounds like a very small detail, but will make a little bit of difference a little bit later on in the day. This is where my friend and I are headed to. Now, if you're going to pick a very significant building to make a statement, it is not Norris Hall. This is a very small, obscure engineering building in our campus. It is so obscure that many of our first responders and those that self-dispatch did not actually even know where it was. Like many of you today, and probably, like myself, we think a lot about exits, physical security nowadays, right? How many doors are there? How many exits? How can I get out? That was not my mindset in 2007. But Norris Hall is very much like a fortress. The walls are extremely, extremely heavy. This is going to misconstrue the sound of gunfire quite significantly. The doors, these are the original doors, are very, very hard to break through. The windows are quite small. We have different types of windows and different types of classrooms, so we will have students that are able to jump out of some of them. But the entire building only has 3 exits. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the other preparatory behaviors that our perpetrator engaged in, but one of them was that he purchased 3 chains for 3 doors about 2 weeks prior to the attack. So the entire attack is going to happen on this second floor hallway of Norris. That morning, my friend and I were racing off to class. We actually talked about skipping class to get coffee and a bagel, which would not have been an unusual decision for myself. I was not the best student at this point in time. I got a lot better after the shooting. But it's an engineering hallway. This is what it looked like back then. My classroom was on the right-hand side of the hallway. This is what it looks like today, following a multi-million-dollar renovation. Now, there are many, many human reasons and costs why we do not want these attacks to occur. But one of the not so fun logistical issues that communities that suffer mass violence have to also grapple with is, what do you do with these spaces after a shooting occurs, right? Who wants to return to do research, to study, to work in these spaces? So our interior classrooms and hallways have been demolished, so my classroom is no longer there as it was. However, if you were there at the time, you kind of know where your space was. As my friend Colin and I walked into class that morning, quite a lot of things had occurred that we did not know about. Our perpetrator had purchased 2 firearms. As Dr. Langford mentioned earlier in the session, he had acquired his weapons once he had really decided and committed to planning carrying out his attack. He went to a gun range near our campus, which I want to be very clear, in southwest rural Virginia, is not an uncommon thing to do. However, he put the targets on the ground, which is, a little bit of a strange thing to do. About 2 weeks prior to the attack, he's going to rent a van where he films a video manifesto. He mails that to NBC the morning of the attack. They unfortunately air it. It is still publicly available today. As you can imagine, I don't really spend a lot of time watching that, but it is out there for you. The morning of the shooting at about 7:05, while I was still asleep off campus, he's going to walk into a dormitory, a massive dormitory on our space. We're not quite sure how he gets in, but again, it's a very friendly, open campus. Probably as students are leaving to go to class, he's allowed to really kind of piggyback into the space. He walks to the 4th floor of that dormitory where he shoots and injures his first victim. The call to our dispatch went out as someone fell out of their bunk bed. There are no cameras in the space. There are some bloody footsteps that kind of trail outside of the door. But police have said, really, if he stops it in there, it would have been really difficult to claim him to that attack. The resident advisor goes to check on the first victim is shot and killed point blank. He goes back to his dormitory. He will delete his cell phone. His email records to this day have not been discovered. He changes his clothes. He goes to our post office just near the kind of the bridge of the campus, where he will mail a package of hateful letters and poems and really a diatribe to our English department. He was an English major at Virginia Tech. These letters, well, one particular letter had a lot of hateful, a lot of grievance-based language, things such as, "You committed a Holocaust against me." He's going to walk into Norris Hall with 3 chains, 2 firearms, over 400 rounds of ammunition, and a knife that he does not use. This is what our classrooms look like. I just want to give you a sense of kind of the spaces that we had. They're all pretty small spaces. We all had these single wooden push doors that push inwards that do not lock. By the time that we returned to campus the following semester, one very large capital investment the university did, every single classroom had a single push function lock on that door just in case you had to secure that space. As we walked in, my friend and I, we sat in the back left-hand corner of the classroom where we always sat. So I was in an intermediate French classroom, and our professor, Madame Joshua Kotor-Novak, would intentionally, pick us up and move us around so we would get to meet our classmates and just, network with other individuals. Because we were so late, we missed that portion of the day. And unfortunately, again, our assignment, our kind of seating in that location is going to make a significant difference as well. Right after we sat down was when we heard the first shots. Now, he does not start firing in my classroom, but further down the hall. And to me, it sounded like an axe being taken to a piece of wood. It was a very quick chop, 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 chop. Again, it's 9:40, 9:45 on a Monday morning. You're half asleep. It's very hard to kind of figure out what could be occurring. But I'm sitting on the side facing the hall, and I can feel the intensity getting closer and closer and closer. My professor went outside into the hallway. She quickly came back in. She said, "Call 911." And you could see the look of color and panic, kind of drained from her face. In those seconds, I got on the floor, kind of under a desk, not really knowing what I was preparing for. And the last thing I recall seeing were my professor and another student try to push their desks towards the door. But literally, as they pushed, he walked in. They didn't have a chance to get the door closed. He shoots them first. He goes to the other side of the classroom and takes an active shooter stance there. From hearing him in the hallway to him being inside of our space is maybe 7-10 seconds. It is incredibly fast. And it's very hard to relate to you via PowerPoint, obviously, how chaotic this is, because there's a lot of extra desks, there's a lot of extra book bags, personal belongings, things like that kind of complicate movement in this space. He doesn't say anything, he doesn't pause, he just goes down the rows of people one by one by one. And it feels very intentional, it felt very pre-planned, which it was, and very kind of focused. When he first walked in, I looked up because you're trying to put logic as to what's possibly occurring. I saw the top torso of a man with 2 arms outstretched and a firearm and a handgun in each. I quickly went back and kind of covered my head with my hands. Again, for the first, I would say 20, 30 seconds, I thought it was some kind of prank or experiment, and I hope that none of you are ever in this situation yourselves. However, if you are, you'll find that you'll trust your instincts in a very big way. And for me, the sound of gunfire and people on the other end, and again, it's a small space, so the smoke filled up very, very quickly, told me that something very serious was going on. No one at any point here is going to say there's a man with a gun. The term active shooter really was not as common as it was, for civilian use in 2007. The first time that I was shot was in the back. Being shot, it feels like a very quick, sharp sting, like a very hot pinch. As it travels and it stops, there's this kind of burning and dullness and heat, and that part sucks. That part does hurt, I'm not going to lie. But the initial impact, depending where it is, you can kind of sit there and take it. He's going to leave our classroom. I've been asked often, what is kind of happening while he's gone. It is very, very quiet. That is something that our first responders also commented on, is the quietness of this space. Every single person but one in my classroom is going to be wounded, a minimum of 3 times to upwards of much more than that. There's only one person that wasn't shot, everyone except for one. He was in the back of the room. He's kind of a smaller guy, and he's telling us really to hold on and to kind of be quiet while we can. The second time that he came back was much scarier than the first, because the first time it happened so quickly. To give you a sense of how quickly this attack transpired, there were some people that were found sitting in their desks how they were when he first walked in. And so I know often, some of us might engage in what's known as active shooter training, or we look at case studies from these events. I think it's very important to be empathetic and kind to the realities of the situations and the closeness to danger that sometimes people are put in. What I'm really trying to say is this is, in all best scenarios, the worst possible case scenario, and I would hope that you kind of view it from that lens. But the second time, you could tell that he was looking to see who was alive. There was more time in between the shots. I was shot a second time. I've been doing this for many years now, as Dr. Mathis is dating me, 10 years at least. I'm joking, it's true. But for many years I fibbed and said I was shot in the back, and the truth is I was shot in the butt, which does hurt. He's gonna leave our classroom, he's gonna come back in for a third time. When he finally sees law enforcement make a successful entry in this space, he's gonna take his own life. So he's found in kind of the top right-hand corner by the door with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He still had over 200 rounds of ammunition left. And so I am very, very thankful for our law enforcement partners that were able to get there as quickly as they had to stop that. But as you can imagine, if you can count for 11 and a half minutes, that's a very long amount of time when you're holding on, waiting for your life. I'm going to play for you very quickly cell phone footage that was taken by a student outside the building. I just want to warn you, you are going to hear gunshots as it's occurring inside. You're also going to hear a lot of just the wind and the snow from that day. That's a difficult thing to listen to. I fully appreciate that. So we can all just take a breath and sit with that for a second. In those 11 and a half minutes, he kills 11 of my classmates and my professor. I want to briefly share with you the individuals from my classroom who passed away. Caitlin Hammerman, Austin Cloyd, Rima Samaha, Matt Laporte, Ross Aladamine, Rachel Hill, Madame, Henry Lee, Daniel Perez, Aaron Peterson, Mary Reed, and Leslie Sherman. You'll often hear survivors refer to ourselves as the club that no one wants to belong to. And we fortunately, and unfortunately, when I say we, I mean injured survivors, have become close friends with many of their brothers, sisters, spouse, families, and so forth. There's one classroom that is important to note. So he was able to successfully break into 4 classrooms. But there's one all the way down at the hall. It was a computer science math class. They actually had a TA in class that day, and they thought the gunshots were construction noise. So they were a bit smarter than us. They went in the hallway. They were going to tell them to be quiet. They saw the weapons. They ran back in their classroom, and about half the students built a barricade using their desks to keep the door shut. Now, they talked about, he shot through the door. He tried to get in twice. They saw the bullets go through the door and out the windows. But those students did not leave that barricade. They stayed there for an hour. Obviously, with what they had heard, they said, we're not going to, come out. He fires 174 rounds during this attack. So this is a very, very loud progression. But as those students are later rescued by our SWAT team and taken out, they're taken out this way down the hallway. And so they see a full crime scene. Those students that are not physically wounded are going to be treated very differently from an organizational, from an institutional, from a settlement perspective than those of us that were physically wounded. I'm not going to go down a deep rabbit hole, but to give you a quick sense, we did not sue the university. That was never on my radar. But our settlements were guided by how many days we spent in the hospital. And so as we think about future and past mass shootings, I ask you to expand that definition of survivor and victim, not only to those that inflict, obviously, physical pain, but those that are privy to the scene, and also those that have to respond to it. When the first responders broke into our classroom, it was the full, guns, shields, regalia. I've had many, SWAT guys since ask me, how did you know we're SWAT? I'm like, as it said, SWAT. They don't mess around. They were quite aggressive. I couldn't talk at this point. I was starting to fall asleep. And so they kind of carried us out. They put me here in the hallway, and they start to hit my face, call me everything but my name. And we're finally taken outside. This is myself in the white shirt, my friend Colin Goddard, who drove us to class that morning. Colin was shot 4 times, thankfully has survived. I very openly don't like this photograph. I don't think it's my best angle by any stretch of the association. You got to find some levity. You got to find, a little bit of red wine also helps. But the way that my parents found out was shortly after this photograph was taken. So at about by 11 a.m. that morning, again, we don't have, social media, smartphones are not, they're still quite in their infancy. My mother was at the dry cleaners when my doctor, Dr. Randy Lester, called and told her 3 things. Your daughter's been shot, we have to operate, and we can't wait for you. And she said she fell to the ground, and my father threw her in the car and my very young brother. and said, basically, we'll buy whatever we need when we get there. My dad said they almost killed them on that 4-hour journey. I've learned, many things through this experience, and one of them is that, relationships are not perfect, but there'll be a time when you cannot make that last final call and things like that. And so I keep voicemails from my parents now, just in case. I pick up every phone call from my mother, even when it's not the most convenient for things, just to kind of check in that regard. I lost part of my largest small intestines. I lost part of my kidney. I lost my gallbladder. I did not return to Virginia Tech that semester. I got to pick my own grades that semester, and I got a very good GPA, which I think was pretty well deserved in some regards. I do want to note there were 17 of us that were physically injured, that we all survived. We all went to hospitals, and we all came back to Virginia Tech. We all graduated, mostly on time. But this is a photograph of myself about a week later coming back to recover. The other reason I really dislike that photograph that I previously showed you is when I woke up in the hospital, I really was still quite in a lot of shock and trauma. I didn't quite appreciate what had happened. And that photograph was on CNN. That picture is everywhere, and has followed us for better or worse. So there is something to claiming control and our narratives around that as well. I was shot 3 times. The third time was in my right toe. And so the reason why I talk about those ugly sneakers that I showed you in the beginning, I'm not going to show it to you this evening, but I have a very fully functional toe thanks to that. In terms of where we sat in the classroom, everyone who survived in my room was in the back left-hand corner of the space. By all kind of best guess and reasoning, he just couldn't walk over. There were too many people, book bags and things, to be able to get back there. This is a photograph of our memorial. If any of you have the chance to visit or even just to Google, it's 32 stones. We are the Hokies. It's what all of our buildings are made out of, one for each of the individuals who lost their lives that day. The center tower that you see there, that is Burris Hall. This is where our president's office, leadership, human resources sit. So as we're talking about recovery and going back into these spaces, some of these folks talked about, we're trying to return to their office and having to physically walk over people that are grieving, that are crying at those steps. This space becomes a very central place to gather, to mourn, to show respect. The university receives 90,000 pieces of unique cards, banners, all these different things that are digitized by our archives. And so again, just thinking about, we have to plan for the long term that exceeds those 3-6 months. The small square, which you can kind of see there to the right, that actually is Burris Hall, where the shooting took place. I'm sorry, not Burris Hall, Norris Hall. As I came back to class, the biggest thing for me was physical security. A lot of classrooms look the same as the one that we were in. There's small spaces, there's one door, one way in or out. A lot of the survivors, we continued on together in the same courses, and so if someone ever walked in late into our class, we would kind of perk up and look at each other, saying like, hey, is this about to happen again? Another thing that was a little bit awkward and strange was telling professors. Virginia Tech very graciously offered to tell our professors in the time afterwards, do you want to be, I don't want to say outed, but told as though that you were there. And so for me, it took about 8 months until I found myself really just bawling, crying off campus. Nothing happened. It was just a quiet moment. I was trying to study when I realized that, hey, I need some help. And the first therapist that I went to was not a great experience. It was on campus. They were doing construction in the building, and so the sounds of hammers or whatever it was, I didn't quite yet know was a trigger to myself around the fear. I finally found a wonderful therapist who, for about 2 years, every single session was, okay, tell me what happened. And some of those were small conversations about getting and deciding to go to class and the guilt around that, to much broader, deeper concepts. And so, the two questions I can't fully answer for you this evening are, why did this happen? We have some ideas around his, intentions, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But why did I survive? And that survivor's guilt is a very, 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 very real thing. One last thing on therapy, I did something called cognitive processing therapy, actually at the University of Washington in Seattle. And it's an evidence-based trauma treatment, looking at any trauma, but looking at how we process the event through these 5 lenses. This was especially helpful for me because I was in this therapy when the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut happened. And this is the only time in my therapy career that I actually had to call a therapist and request a same-day appointment. I made her cry. I remember thinking, get your shit together, Kristen. Like, I need you in this moment. But she's also a human being, and she was pregnant and has her own connections to it. And so I'll get off my therapy pedestal, but I'll say we've all been through difficult things. We've all been through trauma. If we don't do it for ourselves, do it for our families and our friends, right? My parents know about my work and what I do, but there are obviously a lot of things that I don't want to take to them in different scenarios. If you're interested on a bigger level, kind of the impact of these events, in 2012, this group did a report of the cost of the tragedy. Now, this is still a conservative estimate by all accounts of around $48 million. This includes both federal grants that the university received, as well as local state fees and grants. This is some of where the money went to. What's not included in this accounting, which the report also mentions, is the toll to the faculty and staff, right? All those individuals that now have to deal with their own traumas, but also students that are returning. What's not included is ongoing security fees and costs for additional threats. Virginia Tech has unfortunately become, like many other places, a place where perpetrators might have desire to visit or to write letters to, or other, grievance communications, and also brand reputational cost. The university tries very, very hard not to be known as the site where this attack took place. Shifting to my work now, so after the attack, we as my family received a lot of funds. People wanted to show support. Often after communities suffer an event of mass trauma, people send cheese trays, cards, blankets. Those things are all very nice, but I'm saying if you want to help someone, this sounds a bit crass, just send money, because the long-term funding, especially for survivors that might not be physically injured, is quite difficult. And so we put into a nonprofit. I am Ukrainian. I speak Russian, but I make that distinction with Ukraine quite purposefully today because of what's happening in the world. But Koshka is a Russian word for little kitten. It's a family nickname that I've had since growing up. It has nothing to do with school safety. But we work with schools, both K-12 universities, law enforcement departments, companies, really thinking about, essentially, it's workplace violence training with a survivor tint. So it's kind of thinking about how can we talk about prevention, how can we talk about what behaviors to report without frightening individuals. So we help survivors, we train survivors from different experiences, different stories to tell their perspectives kind of in a way that I'm doing this evening. And I think what we do, which may be of service to you, but hopefully not, is connect survivors in the aftermath for recovery. So for example, if we have a principal who suffered a shooting in this year, we may connect them with a principal for someone who's had the experience much longer to talk about anything from how do you do anniversaries, how do you do staff meetings. The challenges and the different types of questions that come up are actually quite significant and still quite pondersome. So why focus on prevention? I think one big discussion is obviously gates, cameras, locks, those types of things have an important function in place in our safety kind of frameworks. But what's the balance of that? And for me, as I began entering this work, I want to briefly talk about this report, which really was focused on school K-12 perpetrators. It was a joint report by the Department of Education, the Secret Service, and they wanted to know of the school shootings that they looked at, what was knowable, what was preventable about these attacks. I'm not going to go into all the findings, but some of the ones that stood out to me, but there is no accurate useful profile of a school shooter. And so for that reason, it is very intentional that you're not going to see our perpetrators photographed today. It is obviously available online more than it needs to be if you needed to access it. And that in about 2/3 of the cases that they looked at, and this still kind of trends and correlates for more current shootings, at least one other person had either knowledge of the attacker's plan, either of their desire to commit a crime or their capacity to do so. So they're trying to acquire weapons or figure out a means to do so. For me, this was just very hopeful in terms of intervention, that there's opportunities prior to someone walking into a space. This most certainly was the case in our shooting at Virginia Tech. Virginia became the first state, as a result of our attack, to mandate what's known as sweat assessment teams in K-12 and later in higher education. Many states, including ours of Washington, have followed suit. These teams are multidisciplinary. In a school setting, they would include someone from academics, a school resource officer, a counselor, legal, EAP, if it needs to be brought in as well. to really look at, is this really a threat, to identify the potential threat, which could come from a myriad of places, assess that so we don't overreact, so we don't kick someone out of school or fire them just because we're afraid of their actions, and build a long-term case management plan around that. One of the critical aspects for success for actually doing this work is community involvement and community discussions. I put this in for you, Dr. Langford, because we talked about reporting and things like that, but it belongs there as well. So what we need is we need students, we need parents, we need employees to proactively speak up when they see something. Now, professionals in the threat assessment field very clearly and articulated state, there is no checkbox, right? There's no ideal 1, 2, 3, 4. These are just some of the things that we want to be looking out for: harassment, bullying, actual threats of violence, an unusual preoccupation with past shootings or past shooters. But context is very, very important, right? Someone that writes a play about committing mass murder might just be the next Stephen King, for example. When I speak with students and kind of the public, I think the biggest thing is really trusting our gut and that first sense of when you feel that something might not be right, that we have the responsibility and the right to very openly voice that. Here at University of Washington, for example, that would go to a group called Safe Campus, which is their threat assessment team. So does this work? Is it successful? These are a couple mostly random clips that I pulled from the internet. These come from Ohio, from Florida, from Maryland, and California, times where someone did speak up. And I think it's interesting in some cases the parent intervened as well to successfully be able to prevent before someone is physically opening fire or has a weapon in a space. So we're talking about more of an active shooter response. The truth is there are hundreds of these successfully averted, prevented cases that happen throughout our country and others. We just don't hear about them very much because they don't get as much media attention. They're less sensational. They're potentially less interesting. But I would argue they're just as important to study. If any of you are interested in threat assessment, kind of learning more about this field, there's a professional association that deals with a lot of this work called ATAP. The FBI has put out a lot of great resource and manuals. And I would recommend the Center book written by Mark Fullman, who's a journalist who entered this work looking at really tracking mass murders. But Trigger Points is kind of a comprehensive history of the field of behavioral threat assessment and where it grew from. It's still a fairly new field. It's been around for about 20, 30 years, rooted in law enforcement, but really expanding out to psychologists, education, things like that. So I would recommend Mark's book. Shifting a little bit to survivors and recovery, we received a bench at Virginia Tech afterwards. It's one of the many things. Some things that I share with folks that work with survivors or might come across survivors, we all have individuals that we know, is obviously healing and time, everyone's experience is very different. Being very conscious of language. I think one thing, when Virginia Tech occurred, this was 2007, I think I was still quite naive. I really thought that there was never going to be an attack again of that scale because of how large our shooting was. And unfortunately, as we know, that is not true. But what we want to really be careful about is not skipping over or forgetting people's experience because only 3 were killed or only 2 were stabbed in this event. We have to be careful not to minimize those experiences. And that survivor guilt can be can look quite different. I know survivors that did not return to the place where their shooting occurred until 20 years after the attack. And so a lot of that healing, a lot of that recovery obviously can kind of begin at that moment in time. Also kind of placement. We have to be very careful to say things like, oh, but you weren't even at work that day, right? You might still have an affiliation, a connection to that space that is very important to acknowledge. And lastly, I'll talk about really just asking people about their experiences. One of the things that I see the most is people often say, well, I'm a little bit afraid to ask you or someone else about an experience because I don't want to trigger you. I don't want to bring something up. And I kind of laugh at that inside because I think there's nothing that you're thinking that I haven't already thought about, right? Or talked about with a therapist and things like that. So especially in workplace settings as well, when our time around the anniversaries and time around trauma can really impact how productive we are, how honest we are and things like that. I think if we think about phrasing these conversations with kindness and with empathy and true interest for the other person's experience, we we can create a much more safer space to have those conversations. I've heard a lot of horror stories of people that go out like drinking with their coworkers. That's when they kind of mention it, like, hey, weren't you there that day? Maybe not the best example to do that. But if you come across, honestly, and again, with empathy, don't feel like you are overstepping. Allow that person to know that they can always say no, thank you, later on if they need to. And on the long term, here are some of the questions that, I don't promise to have all the answers, and I don't think we'll find all of them this evening, but as we talk about what makes our culture and our country unique, one of the unfortunate problems that we have is a very, very large community of survivors, people that were physically injured, close to the scene, knew someone, and they're widespread across the US, right? We now have individuals that are re-traumatized based because of where they live, right? If you're in Colorado, unfortunately, it's very difficult to be a survivor of a mass shooting because so many things have happened in that state. So how do we, some of the questions that we think about is, how do we make sure survivors know about and feel comfortable reaching out for resources? So, a lot of state laws allow us about a year to apply for victim care assistance. Survivors that are not physically injured usually don't take advantage of that in that time for different reasons. Mental health resources, legal aid. How do we acknowledge experiences of all of those, especially 3, 5, 6 years later? If I wanted to get the state of Virginia to pay for my therapy 4 years after the attack, that is a very different conversation than it would have been in the first 3, 6 months after the shooting. What do we do for anniversaries? I have seen and kind of heard accounts of communities that choose to do nothing, that kind of move along, and others that have more appropriate, smaller and bigger events. How do we decrease media consumption? Well, for all of us, but really promote healthy and proactive and preventive conversations in the media instead of focusing on the perpetrators and their acts and things like that, right? As we heard from both presenters this evening, the messages and the language and the proportion of even of images that we use sends a very important message of who's more important, right? We can all name a mass shooter. I'm sure we can't all name all of the victims. Not saying we need to be able to name all the victims, but individuals that really paid a very serious price. And again, as communities suffer additional trauma, what do we do for them? How do we reach out? How do we gauge who needs what at what cost? This is a very, very large project, and I'm not saying we need to fix all of this now, but these are questions that I think need to be considered. This is some of our recovery at Virginia Tech, our slogans, our mottos, things that are very important to our community. We will prevail. Ut prosum is our school motto. It means that I may serve. We are Virginia Tech. The number 32 became very, very important. It's the number of individuals who lost their lives. One issue that arose very quickly after the shooting was that, a lot of our community's activities are centered around football. It's just part of our culture. Some of the families who lost their children felt like things were becoming too much like a football rally and not quite perhaps somber enough. And so again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but figuring out how to balance all of those needs and meet everyone where they're at that time is an ongoing challenge that all these communities unfortunately have to think about. I'm going to end with, I want to share with you a poem by a professor at Virginia Tech, and you'll see some images from our recovery at Virginia Tech in the first few days, weeks, and months. This poem holds a lot of symbolism for those of us that were there that day.
Virginia Tech. We are sad today, and we will be sad for quite a while. We are not moving on. We are embracing our mourning. We are Virginia Tech. We are strong enough to stand tall, tearlessly. We are brave enough to bend to cry, and sad enough to know we must laugh again. We are Virginia Tech. We do not understand this tragedy. We know we did nothing to deserve it, but neither does a child in Africa dying of AIDS. Neither do the invisible children walking the night away to avoid being captured by a rogue army. Neither does the baby elephant watching his community be devastated for ivory. Neither does the Mexican child looking for fresh water. Neither does the Appalachian infant killed in the middle of the night in his crib in the home his father built with his own hands, being run over by a boulder because the land was destabilized. No one deserves a tragedy. We are Virginia Tech. The Hokie Nation embraces our own and reaches out with open heart and hands to those who offer their hearts and minds. We are strong and brave and innocent and unafraid. We are better than we think and not quite what we want to be. We are alive to the imagination and the possibility. We will continue to invent the future through our blood and tears, through all this sadness. We are the Hokies. We will prevail. We will prevail. We will prevail. We are Virginia Tech.
This was the first ever vigil on our campus. I believe there were about 10,000 people in attendance. The university did not hold classes for several years on April 16th. Now we have classes, and it's a day of service, a voluntary service. There's also a large run, a run of 3.2 for 32 that happens every year. But in closing, I want to share two takeaways or two things that I've learned. I think the first is a very tactical one around the importance of prevention. I ask you to go back to your communities, and in whatever way you think you can impact that, and really ask the question of, do we have a threat assessment team? What does that look like? When I'm researching schools and learning about if we're going to make a visit there or things like that, I play the game of how quickly can I find out information about your team by your website. And that is a fun and not so fun game to play. But this concept, this work is growing, and the more and more people that know about it, support it, the more hope we can have for fruitful prevention. And on a broader sense, learn if you can, or try to learn, how to appreciate traffic. I know it's a very painful thing, depending where we're all coming from this evening, but in that moment, there is a gift. It's time. We can think about who to call, who to text later, who to tell that we love, and that type of gift is not one that everyone, unfortunately, gets to have. Thank you all very, very much. I know it's a difficult topic to sit with and to be with, but thank you very much for having us here this evening. And I'm going to bring back, I think, Dr. Eric Matvis to lead us into a panel. Thank you.